It begins in a place that never truly sleeps. The Citadel, quiet at its edges, always seemed to hum with the faint sound of forgotten voices. There were windows that looked out into nothing at all, and yet the glass still caught the shimmer of distant stars. Among countless Mortys, each so alike, there was one who lingered a little longer in silence. He did not look away when the world felt strange. He let the strangeness rest on his shoulders like a heavy but familiar coat, and before I take you too far, let me pause here to say something simple, something true. We care about you. Whoever you are, wherever you may be listening from, know that your presence here matters. You are loved, even if the world has sometimes forgotten to tell you so. Before we begin the story in full, tell us quietly in your heart, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee or maybe just something warm to hold, and let's wander gently into this tale together. This Morty, the one who would someday be called evil, did not begin in anger. His story began in a small corner room, lit by a lamp that flickered whenever the power dipped. He would sit cross-legged on the floor, listening to the hum of the building as though it were singing only for him. Other Mortys played loudly, laughed too much, and tried their best to ignore the unease of their mirrored lives. But he leaned into it. He pressed his ear to the walls and waited for the sound beneath the sound. Sometimes he thought he heard a heartbeat there. Other times, a whisper too faint to catch. It made him different, though he never said so out loud. Words, he discovered, early had a way of making people uneasy when they carried too much truth. So instead, he practiced listening. He let his quietness stretch like a river that wound through a stone city, carving paths invisible to most eyes. There was a moment, one night, when the lamp had gone out entirely. The room was drenched in shadows, but he did not move. He simply sat, watching how the dark shaped itself. He found it comforting, how even in emptiness there was form. That was the first time he realized he did not fear being alone. Solitude, to him, was not emptiness at all. It was a gentle presence, a patient teacher. The others noticed, of course. Other Mortys often tilted their heads at him, puzzled by his calm. They whispered when he passed, calling him strange, sometimes cruel, though he had never raised his voice. But he carried their words like he carried the whispers in the wall. They folded into him, part of the song he was learning. He once sat beside another boy, another version of himself, who asked him why he stared so long at the stars. Evil Morty, or the child who would become him, only shrugged. He didn't always understand his thoughts, but he understood the feeling behind them. A longing, a question with no shape yet. He wanted to know why things repeated, why the Citadel's halls looked the same no matter how far he walked, why the stories told by other Ricks always sounded rehearsed, like lines in a play. The boy laughed at him nervously and ran off to join the noise of the others. Evil Morty stayed. He tilted his face upward, let his eyes rest against the glass. That framed a star field too distant to name. And for the first time, he thought of leaving, not out of rebellion, but out of a quiet pull, the way the tide pulls gently at the shore. It was only a thought, soft and half-formed, like a lullaby, hummed under the breath. Yet it stayed with him, curling itself around his heart. And so his beginning was not sharp, not cruel. It was quiet, tender, and strange. The kind of beginning you might not notice if you were too busy. But if you listened closely, closer than most, you would hear the story already unfolding. in whispers only he could hear. The days in the Citadel folded into one another like pages in a book too often read. For most Mortys, it was enough. The routine, the familiar echoes, the laughter that felt rehearsed, it kept them safe. But for him, safety was not the same as truth. He carried that distinction quietly, never announcing it, never forcing it. It grew in him the way moss grows on stone, slow, patient, and certain. When he was still small, he found himself drawn to the library. It was not a grand place. The shelves leaned, the lights flickered, and dust floated like pale snow in the stillness. Other Mortys went there only when told, but he went because he liked the silence. He liked how books held voices that did not need to be spoken aloud to be heard. Sometimes he would pull a volume down and read a line or two. Other times he would simply hold the book, feeling its weight, imagining the lives that had passed before it. There was a caretaker there, an older Morty with lines on his face. The kind of lines that only came from long practice in keeping secrets. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried the hush of memory. "You listen differently," the older Morty told him once, without looking up from his sorting. Evil Morty, though he was not yet called that, only nodded. He didn't have an answer, only a soft feeling that the older one had seen through him. He began visiting often, sitting in the corner where the light was weakest. Sometimes he traced the patterns of the wood on the table, imagining them as rivers, leading somewhere else. Sometimes he copied down strange symbols, not because he understood them, but because he liked how they felt in his hand. The caretaker never stopped him. Perhaps he understood that these small rituals were not mischief, but survival. Outside, the Citadel pulsed with noise, arguments, experiments, endless debates between Ricks who thought themselves gods of reason. But inside the library, time slowed. Here, the boy found his first taste of freedom, the freedom to be unobserved, the freedom to simply exist without expectation. One evening, while the lamps burned low, the caretaker handed him a torn page. No book, just a page. Its edges were frayed, its words half erased. "Keep this," he said, his tone more like a sigh than instruction. The boy unfolded it gently. The words didn't make sense, sentences broken, meanings lost. But the paper itself felt alive in his hand. He held it as though it were a secret map, though he had no idea where it led. That night, lying in his narrow bed, he placed the page beneath his pillow. He did not dream, or perhaps he did, but could not recall it. What he did remember was the feeling, the strange comfort of knowing he carried something hidden, something entirely his own. For the first time, he had a fragment that no other Morty shared. The following days passed like slow tides. He returned to the library not for answers, but for the quiet company of the caretaker. They rarely spoke. Sometimes the boy wondered if silence itself was their conversation. He began to notice how the caretaker's eyes lingered on the shelves, as if searching for something long lost. In those glances, he recognized himself, a reflection not of sameness, but of longing. It was then he realized that what made him different wasn't sharpness or rebellion. It was tenderness. A tenderness so deep it unsettled those who had forgotten how to carry it. He didn't always understand his own questions, but he felt them alive in his chest. They whispered through him like distant stars humming their slow songs. And quietly, beneath it all, the page beneath his pillow remained. A fragment, a secret, a seed of departure. He did not yet know it, but it was already leading him toward a path that curved away from the Citadel's endless repetition. He grew into his quietness the way some grow into height, almost without noticing. By the time the other Mortys began to crowd into their groups, loud with chatter, restless with mimicry, he had already learned how to stand at the edge and let their noise pass over him like waves against stone. He was not lonely there. In fact, he found a strange kind of companionship in absence itself, as though the air carried a presence when no one else remained. The page under his pillow became a ritual. Each morning, before he left his bed, he would slip his hand beneath and touch the folded paper. Not to read it, he had memorized every broken word by now, but simply to know it was still there. Its fragility taught him something, that the most precious things were not the ones explained or displayed, but the ones protected quietly, close to the heart. Sometimes he wondered about the caretaker, the one who had given it to him. He thought about the way the older Morty's hands trembled slightly, the way his gaze seemed to drift into corners as if he were listening for something beyond reach. Evil Morty, though he was not yet evil, only different, felt a bond he could not name. Not friendship, not family, but something quieter, a recognition perhaps, like two stars far apart, shining in the same rhythm. One afternoon, as the lamps flickered with their usual sigh, the boy asked him, "Do you ever want to leave?" It was the first real question he had ever spoken aloud in that library. The caretaker looked at him for a long moment. His lips curved into the faintest smile, though his eyes were sad. "Every day," he said softly. Nothing more. That answer lingered longer than silence ever could. Outside the library, life in the Citadel carried on. Ricks debated endlessly about theories no Morty could ever win. Mortys played at being themselves, following patterns, repeating the same phrases until even their laughter sounded scripted. He watched them sometimes, not with scorn, but with a gentle ache. They were doing what they knew to do. But he knew something else now, that behind repetition there was the possibility of escape. He began walking the Citadel's quieter corridors at night. Long hallways where the lights buzzed low, staircases that seemed to lead nowhere, doors locked without reason. He did not search for anything in particular, he simply walked, listening for the hum that had first captured him as a child. Sometimes it grew louder, sometimes it disappeared, but always it returned, as though reminding him he was not mistaken. In those walks he noticed details others overlooked, a crack in the wall that ran like a river, a stain on the floor shaped like a star, a window where no stars appeared at all. Each small strangeness felt like a message, though none of them carried words. He collected them in memory the way some collect stones, smooth, ordinary, yet each one unique. One night he found himself standing before a door that did not belong. It was smaller than the others, hidden between two pillars, and for reasons he could not explain, he pressed his hand against it. The handle did not turn, but the cold against his skin stayed with him even after he stepped away. He did not force it, he only acknowledged it, as one acknowledges a dream that lingers after waking. Returning to his room, he slipped the folded page from beneath his pillow and held it under the dim light. Its letters were fading, but that did not matter. What mattered was the reminder. There was more. More than the halls, more than the noise, more than the roles given to Mortys. He pressed it to his chest, then slid it back under and closed his eyes. Sleep did not come quickly. It rarely did. But as he drifted, the hum returned, steady, low, and familiar. A lullaby no one else seemed to hear. and in that sound he felt something stir within him. Not anger, not rebellion, only a longing, soft as breath, deep as the night. Morning in the Citadel was not like morning anywhere else. The light did not rise or fall in its own rhythm. It was switched on, humming through unseen wires, filling the halls with a brightness that felt more artificial than kind. Still he woke slowly, as though the light had crept in naturally. His hand reached first, as always, for the folded page beneath his pillow. Only after feeling its presence did he rise. Breakfast with the others was always the same: long tables, too many voices, food that tasted of nothing. He sat among them, silent, letting the noise wash over him. Sometimes he studied their faces. Every Morty was the same, and yet not. A tilt of the head, a frown that lasted too long, a nervous laugh, all tiny cracks that showed how different they truly were beneath the surface. He noticed these things the way others might notice stars at night. Quiet patterns, subtle but undeniable. One of them, a boy his own age, often sat across from him. This Morty was restless, always tapping his fingers on the table, always sketching on scraps of paper. Once, the boy slid a torn napkin across the table. On it was a crude drawing of a bird, wings too large, eyes too wide. Evil Morty studied it. He didn't say anything, but he slipped the napkin into his sleeve. The other boys smiled, a shy, uncertain smile, and that was enough. That night, he added the napkin to the secret space beneath his pillow, folded beside the page. Two fragile things held close. He didn't think of them as treasures exactly, more like pieces of proof. Proof that even in a place built on repetition, something unique could still emerge. In the days that followed, he and the restless boy began to share a quiet bond. Not in words. Words were loud, clumsy, too easily overheard, but in gestures. A look held a second longer, a half smile across the hall. A drawing slipped into his hand, a silence shared at the edge of a crowd. These were the beginnings of friendship, though neither called it that. He began to wonder if this was what connection felt like, not grand or overwhelming, but soft, like a candle burning in a hidden room. It wasn't something to cling to, it was something to notice, to honor while it lasted. And in the quiet corners of the Citadel, it lasted long enough to change him. Still, his walks through the lonely corridors continued. He found himself returning to the strange, locked door he had discovered before. Each time he pressed his hand against it. Each time it remained cold, unmoving. Yet he felt less frustrated than curious. It was enough for now simply to know it was there. He began to think of it as a promise, a reminder that somewhere beyond walls and wires there was a place he had not yet seen. One evening, while the restless boy sketched at the table, he leaned closer than usual. "Why do you draw?" he asked, his voice barely louder than a breath. The boy paused, pencil hovering. Then he shrugged, eyes distant. "Because it makes me feel like I'm somewhere else." That answer settled into him deeply. Somewhere else. He carried the words with him later that night, repeating them silently as he touched the folded page, the napkin drawing, the hum that lived behind the walls. Somewhere else. The phrase curled in his chest like a hidden fire. As he drifted into sleep, he thought of the bird with its two large wings. He thought of the locked door. He thought of the hum. And for the first time he felt that these things were not separate at all, but pieces of the same song, guiding him gently toward a truth he did not yet have to name. There were mornings when the Citadel felt heavier, as though the walls themselves pressed inward. He could not say why. Nothing outward had changed, yet the air carried a different weight. On such days he found himself listening more closely to the hum that followed him, as though the sound might offer an answer he could not shape into words. The restless boy, the one who drew birds and clouds, seemed to notice these changes too. He sat quieter on those mornings, his fingers still against the table, his eyes distant. Once, while others shouted and laughed over their bland food, the boy leaned forward and whispered, "Do you ever feel like we're trapped in a dream?" The words struck like a secret bell, soft but resonant. He did not answer aloud, but the look he gave was enough. The boy nodded, as if the silence itself confirmed it. That evening they met in the library. The caretaker was gone, shelves dim under tired lights. They did not need books, they only needed the stillness. The restless boy unfolded a scrap of paper, revealing a new drawing. This time it was a door, sketched crooked but careful, with light spilling through its edges. Evil Morty studied it, then glanced at his friend. Neither spoke. Some truths were too fragile to be named. Later that night, alone in his narrow room, he laid the new drawing beside the others. The page, the bird, the door, all hidden beneath his pillow. He touched them in turn, and for the first time he felt as though they belonged to something larger, like pieces of a puzzle scattered in shadows. The thought comforted him. He did not need to see the whole picture yet. It was enough to know it was forming. Days turned, repeating themselves in familiar patterns. Lessons with Ricks who spoke too quickly, chores that felt like rehearsed gestures, gatherings that blurred into noise. But within him, the quiet collection grew. Every small exchange with the restless boy, every hum in the walls, every glance at the locked door, they layered together like threads weaving an unseen cloth. One night, during one of his long walks, he paused at a high window. Beyond the glass stretched a scatter of stars. They looked close, almost near enough to touch, and yet he knew they were impossibly distant. He pressed his forehead to the glass. For a moment, he imagined what it might feel like to drift among them, weightless, untethered, free. The longing was sharp, yet gentle, like the ache of remembering a lullaby half forgotten. He carried that image with him as he returned to his room. When he lay down, the hum was there again, steady and low, like a voice too kind to wake him. He let it fold around him, and in its rhythm he thought of the door his friend had drawn. He thought of the bird, wings wide. He thought of the page, torn but enduring. And in that space between waking and dream, he whispered the words he had never spoken aloud. Somewhere else. The phrase drifted from his lips like a promise to himself, soft as breath, fragile as dawn. The Citadel's nights always carried a strange stillness, but this one felt different. The halls seemed longer, the lamps dimmer, the silence heavier. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, listening for the hum that never quite left him. It came and went like the tide, sometimes faint, sometimes nearer, always steady enough to remind him he was not imagining it. At the far end of a corridor, he paused by the locked door he had found before. Tonight he lingered longer, his palm pressed flat against the cold surface. The door gave nothing back, no creak, no shift, no secret revealed. Yet he felt its presence, as if it were watching him in return. He didn't push. He only leaned closer, breathing softly, letting the silence stretch between them. The restless boy found him there once. It was late, the Citadel almost asleep, yet his friend's footsteps echoed down the hall. "Why do you come here?" the boy asked. Evil Morty, though still only a boy himself, shrugged. It feels, different. He didn't explain more, and the other didn't press. Instead, the restless boy stood beside him, two silhouettes against a door that refused to open. Sometimes companionship was nothing more than standing in the same quiet, sharing the same unanswered question. When they parted, he returned to his room and unfolded the drawings, laying them side by side on his bed. The bird, the door, the fragments of words on the torn page. He studied them in the thin lamplight. Separate, they were only scraps. Together they felt like a path forming, though he could not see where it led. In the days that followed, he began noticing small changes in himself. He was still quiet, still observant, but his silence no longer felt like retreat. It felt like listening. When others laughed too loudly, he heard the hesitation in their voices. When Ricks lectured about control, he heard the cracks in their certainty. He began to realize that the Citadel itself was full of fractures, tiny breaks in its perfect repetition. One afternoon, as he sat in the library, the caretaker spoke again. His voice was slow, careful, as though he weighed each word before offering it. "Most Mortys don't last long here," he murmured, eyes on the shelves. "Not because they're weak, but because they forget themselves." The boy looked up, meeting the older Morty's tired gaze. "And you?" he asked softly. The caretaker smiled faintly. "I'm still remembering." Those words stayed with him. They followed him through the crowded halls, through the quiet meals, through the restless nights. Still remembering. It was not about rebellion, not about escape. It was about holding on to something fragile, something easily lost in the sameness. He understood then that his drawings, his page, his secret walks, they were not rebellion either. They were remembering. That night, he stood once more by the locked door. His friend was not with him, nor was anyone else. Alone, he pressed both hands against the wood and closed his eyes. He didn't imagine breaking it. He didn't imagine forcing it. He simply listened. And in the silence, he thought he heard it again, the hum, low and steady, threading through the air like a lullaby carried on unseen currents. He stepped back at last, not with disappointment, but with quiet acceptance. Some doors opened only when the heart was ready. Until then, it was enough to know it existed. Enough to know that somewhere beyond it lay the possibility of somewhere else. Days continued to pass in their slow rhythm, each one echoing the last, yet he felt something shifting inside him. It was not dramatic, not visible to the others, but he carried it like a secret flame. Each morning he touched the scraps hidden beneath his pillow, the page, the bird, the door. And each morning he felt their quiet weight, reminding him that he was not like the others. Not because he wanted to be different, but because something in him refused to forget. The restless boy remained close, though their friendship lived in glances and small exchanges more than words. Once, in the middle of a crowded hall, the boy slipped him another sketch. It was of a window, wide and open with stars pouring through like rain. He folded it carefully and tucked it away. No one else noticed. For everyone else it was just another day. For him it was proof that someone else also carried the same longing. Later, in the stillness of the library, the caretaker studied him quietly. "You're collecting pieces," he said softly. It wasn't a question, just an observation. Evil Morty didn't deny it. He only lowered his eyes, feeling a warmth in his chest. The caretaker nodded as if to himself, then returned to his work. No advice, no warning, just acknowledgement. Sometimes that was all a growing soul needed. In the evenings, when he and his friend walked together through the dim corridors, they often stopped at the strange locked door. They no longer questioned it. Instead, they stood before it the way others might stand before an altar, silent, reverent, expectant without demand. On one such night, the restless boy whispered, "Do you think it leads out?" Evil Morty tilted his head. "Maybe it leads in," he answered. Neither spoke after that. The Citadel was not cruel to him, not openly. It was not a place of chains or punishments. Its cruelty was softer, hidden in the sameness, the way it wore down differences until they vanished. That was its design, not to wound, but to erase. He knew this now. He saw it in the eyes of other Mortys, in their laughter that didn't quite reach their hearts, in their tired voices repeating the words they had been told. And he carried a quiet grief for them, even as he learned to guard his own small fragments of self. One night, he dreamed. In the dream, he stood in a vast field of stars, endless and shifting, like the sky had opened just for him. He held the bird in one hand, the door in the other, and the torn page pressed against his chest. The stars hummed the same steady note that followed him in waking life. When he woke, his room was dark, and for a moment he could not tell if he was still dreaming. He reached beneath his pillow and felt the scraps waiting there. Real, solid, his proof. He lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling, listening for the hum. And when it came, soft, low, patient, he let it guide him towards sleep again, as though it were singing only for him. The Citadel began to feel smaller, though. Its corridors stretched endlessly. It wasn't that the place had changed, it never did, but that he could now see its edges more clearly. He noticed the patterns, the same lessons repeated, the same voices echoing, the same routines folding in on themselves. It was like watching a play that never ended, where each actor forgot they had performed the scene before. One evening, the restless boy asked, "Don't you ever wonder why we're here?" They were sitting by the dim glow of a broken lamp, a place where few others wandered. Evil Morty hesitated. "I wonder," he admitted softly, "but I don't ask." The boy frowned. "Why not?" He traced a line in the dust on the floor, shaping it into a spiral, because the answer might be worse than not knowing. Still, the questions grew between them, unspoken most of the time, but present in every glance, every quiet breath. They became companions not just in silence, but in the hidden recognition that something about their world was incomplete. The Citadel was full of Mortys, yet in their shared doubt they felt strangely alone. The caretaker watched them sometimes from afar. His gaze was steady, not unkind, but touched with a sadness they could not name. One day, as Evil Morty returned a book, the caretaker placed a hand on the shelf beside him and whispered, "Don't lose your questions. They're heavier than answers, but they last longer." Then he turned away, leaving the boy with a weight he did not yet know how to carry. That night the locked door seemed different. Perhaps it was only the flicker of the lights above, or the way the silence pressed closer. But Evil Morty felt as though the door was breathing. His hand trembled as he placed it on the wood. He half expected it to pulse beneath his fingers, to open, to reveal some truth. But it remained still, patient, unreadable. His friend stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching. Neither spoke. The silence was its own language. Later, in his room, he unfolded his growing collection of sketches: bird, door, window, page. Each one incomplete, yet together they suggested a shape he could not yet see. He rearranged them on the bed, shifting one beside the other, searching for a pattern. There was no clear picture, no hidden message, but he felt it, like the edge of a dream he could almost remember. As he lay back, the hum returned, low and steady, the same sound that had followed him for so long. But tonight it felt closer, as though the walls themselves were carrying it to him. He closed his eyes, letting it wash over him, letting it sink into his bones. He did not know if it came from the locked door, from the Citadel itself, or from some place far beyond. All he knew was that it was real, and that it was his. Sleep took him gently. In his dream, the hum became a song without words, but filled with a promise that there was more than this. That beyond sameness, beyond silence, something waited. He clutched the torn page to his chest even in sleep, afraid that if he let it go, he would forget the dream before morning. Morning in the Citadel never felt like morning. The lights hummed on at the same time, the corridors filled with the same footsteps, and the voices around him spoke in practiced tones, repeating the same rhythms of days before. Yet inside Evil Morty, something was shifting, small and almost imperceptible, like a seed pressing quietly against the earth above it. He found himself walking slower, listening longer. The world around him was full of murmurs, echoes, and patterns he had never truly noticed. A group of Mortys recited lessons they had memorized, their voices overlapping like a single wave. A cluster of Ricks argued, each believing themselves cleverer than the other, though their words looped endlessly back on themselves. For the first time, he wondered if everyone else felt the sameness too, but chose not to speak of it. Or perhaps they truly did not see it at all. The restless boy sat with him during these quiet hours, their conversations weaving between whispers and silences. "Do you ever think," the boy began, his eyes following the ceiling as though searching for cracks, "that there's another way of living?" Evil Morty studied him carefully. "What would that way be?" The boy shrugged, a small gesture full of longing. "I don't know, just different. Something that doesn't feel like a loop." It was in moments like these that their bond deepened, not with loud declarations, but with the quiet recognition that both carried the same ache. Neither had the words to define it, but they knew it was there, an invisible thread tying them together in their unspoken hope. The caretaker noticed. His voice, when it found them, was always patient, always steady. "You look far away," he said to Evil Morty one afternoon as he sorted books. Evil Morty lowered his gaze, unsure if it was safe to answer. "I just think." The caretaker smiled faintly, a smile that carried both warmth and weariness. "That's more dangerous than it sounds, you know." His hand brushed dust from the cover of an old book, as though to soften the weight of his words. "But sometimes it's the only path worth taking." That night, the hum returned, more insistent. Evil Morty lay awake, tracing patterns across the ceiling with his eyes. The sound wasn't loud, but it was constant, like the heartbeat of something vast. He rose from his bed, carrying his scattered sketches to the floor. Bird, door, spiral, window, page. He placed them in a circle around him, as though arranging a map only he could read. His friend stirred awake and came to sit beside him. For a while, they said nothing, simply looking at the shapes together. The restless boy reached out and turned one of the drawings upside down, shifting the entire pattern. Something about it felt new, different. A window turned became a doorway. A bird, when inverted, resembled something closer to an open eye. The shift was small, but it filled the room with an unfamiliar stillness, a hush that felt alive. In that hush, Evil Morty felt something stir inside him, a realization that perhaps meaning wasn't hidden in the world itself, but in how he chose to see it. The sketches weren't fragments of a puzzle waiting to be solved. They were reflections of his own reaching, his own need to connect scattered pieces into something whole. His chest felt heavy, but not with despair. It was the heaviness of recognition, of carrying a truth too large to put into words. He looked at his friend, who was watching him quietly, and understood without speaking. The loop could be broken, but only by believing it wasn't unbreakable. When sleep finally came, it carried him gently, like drifting through a soft current. The hum followed him there too, weaving into his dreams. This time, the sound was not just background, it was a call. Not urgent, not sharp, but steady, patient, and waiting. Like a door that had always been unlocked, though he had never dared to turn the handle. Evil Morty woke with the hum still, in his ears, softer now, as though it had hidden itself behind the ordinary sounds of the Citadel. Yet he carried it with him through the day, a thread beneath his thoughts. When he walked through the corridors, when he sat in the classrooms, when he watched the endless motions of other Mortys and Ricks, the sound lingered, steady and patient. He began to notice the smallest details, the kind that others passed by, without a thought. A crack in the wall where light leaked through. A faded name carved into a desk, the letters almost gone with time. A bird, not drawn but real, trapped in one of the high glass domes of the Citadel, beating its wings against the barrier before it finally rested in exhaustion. He stood for a long time watching it, feeling something stir in him, something close to sorrow, but also recognition. The restless boy joined him later, and together they looked at the place where the bird had been. "It tried to fly out," the boy whispered, almost reverent. Evil Morty nodded. "It didn't know the dome was there." For a moment neither spoke. Then the boy sighed, a sound that carried both defeat and longing. "Maybe none of us know the dome is there." Those words stayed with him. That night he returned to his sketches. He drew a dome, a circle pressing down on the shapes beneath it. He shaded it darker than the rest, his hand moving slow, deliberate. When he looked at it finished, he felt his breath catch. The dome looked less like glass and more like a lid, a container, a cage. The caretaker found him the next day, still carrying that heaviness in his chest. "You've been seeing further lately?" the caretaker said, though his tone was more statement than question. Evil Morty didn't deny it. "It feels like there's something outside all this, something bigger. I don't know what it is, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish. The caretaker studied him for a long while, then placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. "Keep that feeling close," he murmured. "It will guide you, even when nothing else makes sense." Later, he and the boy wandered to the quiet corner by the broken lamp again. The boy whispered stories of places that might exist beyond, fields where the sky never ended, cities that sang instead of spoke, rivers that carried dreams instead of water. Evil Morty listened, his eyes half closed, imagining each place. He knew the boy's stories were only guesses, soft inventions, yet he felt something bloom inside him when he heard them. That night, when the hum returned, he did not resist it. He let it flow through him, filling the spaces where words could not go. And in the edge of his dreaming, he felt a strange certainty settle in his heart. One day, he would leave the Citadel. Not in rebellion, not in haste, but in quiet necessity, as naturally as the bird had tried to lift itself toward the sky. The thought frightened him, yet it also soothed him, as though it had always been waiting there inside him, patient and unspoken. He fell asleep with that feeling pressed close, like a secret he was only just beginning to name. Days in the Citadel were never measured by seasons, yet Evil Morty began to feel as though something inside him was quietly shifting, like a change in the weather that no one else could sense. The lessons felt thinner, the hallways longer, the air heavier. What once had been enough to fill a day now left him restless, searching for something he could not yet name. He and the restless boy spent more time together, often in silence. Their conversations had grown into pauses, half-thoughts, and glances that said more than words. Sometimes they simply walked the same corridors, matching footsteps, their shoulders almost brushing but never quite touching. The companionship was a comfort, steady and wordless, as though they were the only two who shared the same invisible map. One evening, the boy spoke softly, his voice so low it nearly vanished into the hum of the lights above. "Do you think the Citadel will ever change?" Evil Morty hesitated. He wanted to believe it might, yet every corner told him otherwise. "Not on its own," he answered at last. The boy looked away, his eyes distant. "Then maybe it's us who have to change." The thought lingered between them like the fading echo of a bell. The caretaker crossed their path again that week, his hands full of old pages he was sorting. His presence was calm, grounding, like a lantern that never burned too brightly but always held a steady glow. He caught Evil Morty watching him and smiled faintly. "You carry too much for someone your age," he said gently. Evil Morty frowned. "I don't know how not to." The caretaker paused, setting down a stack of papers. "Then perhaps the question isn't how to carry less, but how to grow strong enough to carry what matters." That night, Evil Morty sat with his sketches again. He added new ones without realizing, a lantern, small but steady, and beside it, a path winding into the distance. When he placed the drawings together, the shapes no longer looked scattered. They began to form something closer to a journey, a movement forward. The restless boy leaned over his shoulder, studying them with quiet awe. "It's like you've drawn a story," he whispered. Evil Morty nodded, though he wasn't sure yet what the story meant. The hum returned, familiar yet changed. This time it rose and fell like breath, like the slow rhythm of waves against a shore he had never seen. He closed his eyes and let it carry him, sinking deeper, until his body softened into the quiet. In the dream that followed, he stood at the edge of an endless plain, the lantern from his sketches glowing faintly in his hand. The path stretched ahead, uncertain but waiting, and though he could not see where it led, he felt no fear. Only a deep, patient knowing. When he woke, the sketches were still scattered on the floor, but the feeling remained. He gathered them carefully, pressing the torn page to his chest as he always did. The Citadel hummed on outside his room, unchanging, but inside him a truth was forming, even in sameness, something new was beginning to take shape. The Citadel stretched on as it always had, a place without sunrise or sunset, where time was measured only in tasks completed and lessons repeated. Yet Evil Morty had begun to feel the weight of repetition more sharply now, as though each cycle left behind a faint echo that only he could hear. He carried that echo with him, a low ache beneath his thoughts. He noticed how the Ricks moved through their days, heads bent, voices sharp, laughter that often sounded more like dismissal than joy. They argued loudly, endlessly, but their words seemed less like truths and more like performances, each trying to prove themselves cleverer than the rest. Evil Morty watched them from the quiet edges, wondering if all that noise was just another way of hiding the silence beneath. One day, while shadowing a group of Ricks in their laboratory, he saw something that unsettled him. A Morty, no older than himself, standing obediently by, waiting to be told what to do. His eyes were blank, his posture still, as though all curiosity had been stripped away. A Rick spoke to him not with care, but command, snapping orders, correcting sharply, never once asking what the boy thought or felt. Evil Morty could not look away. For a moment he saw himself reflected there, and the sight left him trembling. That evening, the restless boy found him sitting alone by the broken lamp, his sketches scattered on the floor. "What happened?" the boy asked quietly. Evil Morty hesitated before answering. "I saw a Morty who wasn't there anymore. Not really, just following like a shadow." The boy's face tightened, his voice little more than a whisper. "That could be any of us." The thought hung heavy in the air, and neither knew how to lift it. The caretaker crossed their path not long after. He looked at the boys, at their tired eyes, and seemed to understand without asking. "The Citadel wasn't built for questions," he said gently, his voice carrying both sorrow and strength. "But questions are what keep you alive." He placed a worn book in Evil Morty's hands, its cover faded, its pages frayed. "Keep this close. Not for the answers inside, but for the reminder that someone, somewhere, once dared to write them down." That night, Evil Morty opened the book under the dim glow of his room. The words were not entirely clear. Some were lost to age, others too tangled to follow, but the feeling of them mattered more than their meaning. Each page whispered of voices long gone, of people who had once reached beyond their cages, even if they never broke them. He traced the faded lines with his fingers, feeling less alone. The hum returned as he drifted towards sleep, steady and patient. It wove itself into the turning of the pages, into the silence of the Citadel, into the ache in his chest. This time, the hum felt less like a mystery and more like a companion, as if it had been waiting all along for him to listen closely. In his dreams, he saw the Morty from earlier, the one who had stood blank and still. But in the dream, that Morty's eyes flickered with a small spark, and he turned to face Evil Morty, as though silently asking him not to forget. He woke with the book still pressed to his chest, the sketches at his side, and a quiet vow forming in his heart. He would not let himself become only a shadow. Evil Morty began to notice the way other Mortys moved through their days, and how different his own steps had quietly become. Most shuffled in quiet obedience, their voices subdued, their eyes lowered when Rick spoke. They answered when asked, they followed when told, and rarely did they pause to wonder why. It was not that they were unkind or unfeeling, but that something in them had been shaped to fit the narrow paths laid before them. He tried sometimes to mirror them, to keep his head down, to answer without thought, to carry the same blank stillness. but the act felt heavy, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. The questions inside him would not stay silent. They pressed against his chest until even his quiet breaths seemed louder than the rest. One afternoon, during a lesson, Rick asked a question that was meant to have one neat, expected answer. Evil Morty hesitated before speaking, and when he did, his reply wandered away from the narrow path. He did not even mean to rebel. He simply spoke what came naturally, shaped by the thoughts that had been growing inside him. The room went still. The Rick frowned, his voice sharp. "That's not the answer." Laughter rippled from the other. Ricks and a few Mortys shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Evil Morty lowered his gaze, but inside something strange stirred. A small flame, fragile yet steady. After class, the restless boy found him in the corridor. "You didn't sound wrong," he said, his voice hushed. "You sounded real." Evil Morty let out a faint breath, unsure whether to feel comforted or more afraid. "Real isn't always welcome here." The boy placed a hand briefly on his arm, a quiet anchor in the stream of sameness. That night, Evil Morty returned to his sketches. He drew not symbols this time, but faces. His own, the boy's, and even the blank-eyed Morty he had seen in the laboratory. Each face carried something different: curiosity, longing, emptiness. When he looked at them together, he realized what set them apart was not their shape, but the light, faint or absent, behind their eyes. He traced the lines slowly, his hand trembling, as if he were trying to preserve something fragile. The caretaker appeared again in the days that followed, his presence steady as ever. He studied the drawings and spoke softly. "The hardest thing isn't to see what others cannot. It's to hold on to it when the world insists you let it go." Evil Morty met his eyes for a long moment, the weight of the words pressing deep. He didn't answer, but the truth of it stayed with him. That evening as he lay down, the hum returned. It was stronger now, though not in volume, stronger in presence, as though it had moved closer, circling around him. He felt it vibrate through his chest, not like noise, but like a second heartbeat. In his dream, he stood in a great hall where countless Mortys walked in circles, their steps echoing in endless rhythm. Yet when he paused, the hum guided him to look upward. Above the hall was a ceiling of glass, and beyond it stars. He woke with tears on his cheeks, though he could not say why. The Citadel remained unchanged in the morning, but inside him the difference grew clearer. He could no longer pretend he was like the rest. He was beginning to understand that the flame inside him, however small, was something he could not put out. Evil Morty moved through the Citadel as quietly as he always had, but now each step felt different. He no longer walked as a shadow among shadows. There was something in his gaze, some small refusal, though most never noticed. The Ricks continued their endless debates, their laughter sharp, their orders quick. The other Mortys followed with lowered eyes, blending into the rhythm. Yet Evil Morty carried a silence that did not bend. He found small ways of stepping aside. When told to repeat a phrase, he spoke it softer, as though the words belonged to someone else and not to him. When given tasks, he lingered a little longer, paying attention not to the instructions, but to the spaces in between them, the overlooked corners, the patterns no one else cared to see. His defiance was not loud, not obvious. It was in the pauses, in the gentleness of his refusal to surrender his questions. the restless boy noticed first. "You're changing," he whispered one evening as they sat by the broken lamp. Evil Morty frowned faintly. "How?" The boy studied him, his eyes thoughtful. "You don't look down anymore. Even when you don't say anything, it feels like you're standing taller." Evil Morty didn't answer, but the words settled deep inside him, carrying both comfort and unease. One day, during another lesson, he saw a Morty hesitate before answering a Rick's question. The pause was brief, but Evil Morty noticed it, a flicker of resistance soon swallowed by obedience. He wondered if others carried the same quiet unrest he felt, but lacked the strength to hold on to it. The thought ached inside him, an ache not of judgment, but of kinship, like watching someone drown in silence while you yourself struggled to breathe. The caretaker's presence returned as though summoned by that heaviness. They crossed paths in a narrow hallway where the light flickered. "You've been carrying yourself differently," the caretaker said softly. Evil Morty's eyes lowered, uncertain. "Is that dangerous?" The caretaker's expression was unreadable for a moment, then softened. "Perhaps, but it's also necessary. Some doors only open for those who refuse to look away." His hand brushed the wall as he passed, leaving Evil Morty with words that rang louder than the empty corridor. That night, he added another sketch. This one was simple. A door, half open, with a faint glow spilling out. He stared at it for a long time before setting it among the others. The restless boy leaned over, tracing the lines with his fingertip. "Maybe the glow isn't what's behind the door," he murmured. "Maybe it's you, standing in front of it." The thought lingered like a quiet flame, lighting the air between them. The hum returned as sleep drew near, weaving into the stillness of his room. It felt closer than ever, not surrounding him this time but rising from within, as if his own chest had begun to echo with it. In his dream, he saw himself standing before countless doors, some locked, some open, some hidden, in shadow. The hum guided him not to the brightest one, but to the one that seemed almost invisible, waiting in silence. He reached for it, his hand trembling, and woke just before his fingers touched the handle. The Citadel was unchanged in the morning, the same corridors, the same voices, the same sameness. Yet Evil Morty carried the dream like a hidden lantern, its glow faint but steady. It was not rebellion, not yet. It was something quieter, deeper, the certainty that he no longer belonged to the rhythm around him. The cracks began in whispers, not in shouts. Evil Morty noticed them first in the way other Mortys glanced at him when he passed. Their eyes lingered a moment longer, searching, though none dared speak. He did not know whether it was suspicion or recognition, but either way the silence around him had changed. During one gathering, as the Ricks argued about numbers and control, Evil Morty felt the restless boy's gaze fixed on him. Later, in the safety of the dim-lit room, the boy asked, "Do you think they can tell that you're different?" Evil Morty hesitated. "I don't try to be. I just can't be like them." The boy nodded slowly, as though the answer had been waiting inside him all along. It was not long before the other Mortys began to test him. One handed him a task with eyes lowered, as though offering something more than routine. Another brushed against him in the corridor and whispered a question too faint to be fully heard, but heavy with meaning. "Do you see it too?" Evil Morty didn't reply, but the question lived with him for days, echoing louder than any command from a Rick. The first true crack appeared during a lesson. A Rick demanded an answer, impatient, his voice cutting through the room like glass. A Morty stumbled, his voice shaking as he tried to recall the words drilled into him. Before he could finish, Evil Morty spoke instead, calm and steady. Rick turned, frowning, caught off guard by the interruption. But the answer was correct, and so he moved on. Still in that silence that followed, Evil Morty felt the weight of every Morty's gaze pressing upon him. He had broken the rhythm, and they had all seen it. That night, his sketches grew restless. Lines crossed over each other, doors leading into spirals, stars drawn with cracks running through them. The restless boy watched in silence until finally he whispered, "You're not just different. You're dangerous to them." Evil Morty looked at him, the pencil still in his hand. "Do you believe that's bad?" The boy shook his head. "I believe it's the only thing that matters." The caretaker's voice returned soon after, as though answering the boy's words. This time he found Evil Morty in the observation deck, staring into the cold scatter of stars. "The cracks are opening," the caretaker said, his tone neither warning nor comfort, only truth. Evil Morty's jaw tightened. "And when they notice?" The caretaker's eyes gleamed faintly in the starlight. "They always notice, but the question is not when. The question is, will you stand when they turn toward you?" Evil Morty said nothing. Yet deep within, the hum that had followed him for so long began to pulse stronger, not as a distant echo, but as something rising from within him. He felt its rhythm steady and calm, a reminder that even cracks could be openings, and that silence, if carried long enough, could become a voice. The call-out came on an ordinary day, in the middle of a lesson that was meant to be forgettable. Evil Morty had settled into his place, silent, ready to let the routine wash over him like rain. But the Rick who presided that day was sharper than most, his eyes darting with suspicion, his words clipped like blades. He watched the Mortys not as students but as suspects, scanning for flaws. When Evil Morty answered too quickly, too cleanly, the Rick stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than any reprimand. "You," the Rick said, pointing. His finger was casual, but his eyes gleamed with accusation. "You speak like you think you're not one of them. Tell me, what makes you so sure of yourself?" The words pressed against the walls, echoing in the still air. The other Mortys froze, waiting. Evil Morty felt the hum inside him, steadying his breath. He did not rush. "I'm not sure," he said softly. "I just listen differently." The Rick sneered, unsatisfied. "Different can be dangerous. Remember that." He moved on, yet the mark had been made, like ink spilled across. A page afterward, the restless boy found him. His face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "They saw it," he whispered. "They saw you. It won't fade now." Evil Morty wanted to reassure him, but no words came. Instead, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, not as comfort, but as a promise. The whispers spread. Mortys leaned closer when he passed. Some with awe, some with fear, some with quiet hope. The line between isolation and recognition had blurred, and Evil Morty knew he could never return to the quiet anonymity he once carried. That night, as the stars hung like patient witnesses, the caretaker appeared again. His voice was softer than before, almost sorrowful. "The mask has slipped. You cannot hide in the crowd anymore." Evil Morty turned to him, his voice steady. "Then I will stop hiding." The caretaker studied him, long and slow, before nodding once. "Sleep would not come easily that night. But when it did, Evil Morty dreamed not of doors or spirals, but of a single window opening outward into endless light. The change was not announced. It arrived in the small, almost invisible ways that only someone listening carefully could notice. A nod in the hallway, a pause before speaking, a glance held a little too long. Evil Morty began to sense it first in the restless boy, who now walked beside him with a kind of quiet pride, no longer trying to shrink into the background. Then others followed. Mortys who had once avoided his eyes now seemed to seek them, as if silently asking to be seen. One evening, while the Citadel's endless machinery hummed through the walls, a Morty slipped into the room where Evil Morty was sketching. He said nothing at first, only watching the pencil move across the page. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled. "When you answered that, Rick, it felt like you were answering for all of us." The words hung in the air, fragile, almost afraid to exist. Evil Morty looked up, meeting his eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. He only nodded, slow and deliberate, as though the silence itself was enough of an answer. Soon others came, not in groups but in quiet trickles, as though afraid to be noticed together. They didn't ask for plans or promises, they only wanted to stand near him, to share the unspoken comfort of knowing that someone else felt the same fracture within the walls of the Citadel. In their company, Evil Morty began to feel something he hadn't known he was missing. Not power, not recognition, but trust. Fragile, unsteady, but real. The restless boy was the first to say what the others could not. "They're waiting for you," he whispered one night, as the stars blinked faintly through the high windows. "Not to save them, not even to lead them, just to show them it's possible." Evil Morty felt the hum within him again, stronger now, less like a secret, and more like a voice. "Possible to what?" he asked. The boy smiled faintly. "Possible to be more than a shadow of a Rick." The caretaker appeared less often, as if stepping back, watching from a distance. But when he did appear, his words carried a new weight. "They are aligning with you, whether you wish it or not. Do not mistake their hope for weakness. Hope, in a place like this, is sharper than any weapon." Evil Morty listened, feeling the truth in it, though he still wondered if he deserved. That night, when he finally slept, he dreamed of threads, thin golden lines stretching between Mortys, weaving into a fragile net. He stood at its center, not holding the threads, but simply being the point where they crossed. And in the dream, the net did not break. The attention came slowly, like a storm first sensed in the change of air. The Ricks had always kept their eyes on each other, measuring, competing, outmaneuvering. Mortys were background noise, a necessary hum in their grand experiment. But now that hum carried a new tone, and some Ricks began to notice. They saw Mortys lingering too long together, pausing in corridors, exchanging glances that stretched beyond obedience. And when they looked closer, they always found Evil Morty at the center, not commanding, not speaking loudly, but simply present, an anchor in the quiet. One Rick, sharp-eyed and suspicious, summoned him during an inspection. His words were casual, but his gaze was cutting. "You're gathering admirers, Morty. That's not healthy here." Evil Morty met his stare without flinching. "I don't gather anyone," he replied softly. "They come on their own." The Rick smirked, but behind the smirk was unease, a flicker of something unsettled. He dismissed Evil Morty with a wave, yet the encounter left an invisible mark. The restless boy sensed the shift before anyone else. That night, while they sat in the dim room, He leaned close, whispering like the walls themselves might be listening. "They've started watching. I can feel it." Evil Morty didn't deny it. He only traced another sketch into the paper, the pencil scratching like faint thunder. The drawing was of an open hand, palm facing upward, with lines spilling from it like light. Soon, whispers among Mortys turned cautious. Some pulled away, afraid of being seen near him. Others pressed closer, unwilling to let go of the quiet hope he had given them. It was not unity. It was something looser, fragile, like fireflies in the dark. Some lights vanished, others glowed brighter, but together they still formed a constellation around him. The caretaker appeared one last time that week, his voice quieter than ever, like the edge of a fading dream. "The gaze is turning toward you," he said, "and once seen, you cannot return to the shadow." Evil Morty asked, "Should I fight it?" The caretaker's expression softened, not with certainty, but with sorrow. "No, you only need to remain. Let them come, let them see. Your strength is not in defiance, it is in being unshaken." That night, Evil Morty could not sleep. He lay awake beneath the ceiling lights that never fully dimmed, listening to the Citadel's endless hum. Yet beneath it, beneath the fear, beneath the weight of watching eyes, he felt the steady rhythm within him again. Not louder, not sharper, only certain. Like a heart that had always known its own beat, waiting for the world to hear it. The tests began quietly, disguised as routine. A Rick would call on him more often than the others, pressing for answers that twisted in circles. Another would assign him tasks meant to break his patience, timed and repeated until the hours blurred together. They were not punishments, not yet. They were measurements, ways to see if he would stumble, if the cracks others whispered about were real. Evil Morty endured them in silence. He spoke when needed, his voice calm, unshaken. He moved through the halls with steady steps, refusing to give them more than they demanded. Yet the Mortys noticed. They saw the way questions bent toward him, the way eyes followed him longer than anyone else, and though none dared say it aloud, they began to understand. He was being tested not as a Morty, but as something more. One evening, the restless boy brought him a sandwich from the rations hall, holding it out with both hands as if it were an offering. "They're pushing you," he said softly. "They want you to break." Evil Morty took the sandwich, setting it aside untouched. "Then I won't," he replied. The boy stared at him, wide-eyed, as though the certainty in those words was enough to steady him too. Another Morty, braver than most, stopped him in the corridor the next day. "Why don't you fight back?" he asked, voice trembling, glancing around for listening ears. Evil Morty paused, studying the boy's face. "Because fighting is what they expect," he answered. "Remaining is what they fear." The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Sometimes understanding came later, like echoes catching. Up to the sound, the Ricks, unsatisfied by his composure, sharpened their trials. They set impossible problems before him, demanded answers while others watched. Evil Morty answered carefully, not too quickly, not too slowly, enough to pass, but not to shine. He understood the game now. To remain unnoticed was impossible, but to survive unnoticed required balance, patience, a refusal to give them exactly what they sought. At night, when the Citadel settled into its humming restlessness, he returned to his sketches. The lines grew gentler, less frantic. Stars still filled his pages, but now they were connected, joined in constellations. Each drawing seemed to echo the fragile trust gathering around him. Each line was a thread, each star, a quiet soul reaching toward another. Sleep found him eventually, soft and slow. In his dreams, the tests dissolved, the walls of the Citadel faded, and he stood beneath an endless sky where no eyes measured him, where no voice demanded his compliance. The stars there were not questions. They were simply light. The moment came not with a shout, but with a single question spoken too sharply. The Rick leading the session had grown tired of patience. His eyes burned with suspicion, and he turned toward Evil Morty with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "If you're so clever," he said, "then tell us this. Why should any of you exist at all?" The words dropped like stones into the room. Morty's shifted uneasily, eyes down, hearts caught in their throats. It was not a question meant to be answered. It was a trap. Evil Morty felt the silence pressing against him, heavy as stone. The hum within him rose, steady and certain, no longer something he could ignore. He could have stayed quiet, could have let the silence swallow him whole. But instead his voice came, calm and clear. Because even shadows cast light when they gather together. The room froze. The Rick's smirk faltered for just a breath. Around him, Mortys lifted their heads, startled, as if hearing their own thoughts spoken aloud for the first time. The moment was brief, but it was enough. Something had shifted, a thread pulled loose from the weave of silence. The Rick barked, a laugh sharp and dismissive. "Pretty words," he sneered, moving on as though the answer meant nothing. But the Mortys remembered. They carried it in their eyes, in the way they looked at each other afterward. A sentence had been planted, small but unshakable, and it grew in the quiet corners where the Ricks never cared to look. That night, the restless boy clung to Evil Morty's side, his voice trembling with wonder. "You said it out loud," he whispered. "You said the thing we all feel." Evil Morty met his gaze, and though he said nothing more, he placed a hand gently over the boy's. It was not reassurance. It was a vow. In the dim solitude of his room, he sketched again. This time, not stars or spirals, but a single candle flame, drawn with lines so soft it seemed almost alive. Around it, he traced a circle of shadows, not consuming, but protecting. When he finished, he sat back and let the drawing rest. Sleep did not come easily. The words replayed in his mind, not like an echo, but like a beginning. And when he finally drifted into dreams, he saw the candle again, burning steady, its small flame refusing to die. The words began to move like whispers carried by the air. No one spoke them loudly, not even in the safety of dim-lit rooms, but they travelled from one Morty to another as though carried in their breath. Even shadows cast light when they gathered together. Some repeated it as comfort, others as a secret prayer, a reminder that their quiet lives held meaning beyond what the Ricks allowed. Evil Morty never repeated the phrase. He did not need to. It lived now without him, finding its way into the corners of the Citadel where eyes did not watch and ears did not care to listen. He would catch glimpses of it in the way Mortys nodded to each other, or in the sudden brightness of a gaze that had long been dim. The restless boy was the boldest. He hummed the words like a tune, soft and tuneless, while he worked through the endless assignments. Once he even whispered them to another Morty in passing, and though fear crossed the boy's face, so did a fragile smile. It was not rebellion. It was something smaller, gentler, like keeping a candle hidden in the folds of one's hands. The Ricks noticed nothing, or perhaps they dismissed it as meaningless chatter. Their focus was always on calculations, power, their endless games, with each other. They could not hear what did not sound like a threat, but to the Mortys it was a kind of lifeline, thin and trembling, yet strong enough to remind them that they were not alone. One night, Evil Morty sat awake at his desk, staring at his sketches. He had drawn stars again, but this time each was linked by faint lines into a constellation that stretched across the page. As he studied it, the restless boy leaned close. "It's them," he whispered. "All of us. We're starting to see each other." Evil Morty didn't reply. Instead, he closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum within him. It was stronger, now not hidden, not shy. It pulsed in time with the unspoken bond forming around him, quiet and undeniable. When sleep finally came, he dreamed of hundreds of candles burning in silence. None was large, none was bright enough alone, but together they filled the room with a gentle glow, pushing back the dark without effort, without struggle, simply by being there. The consequence arrived in the smallest of gestures. A Rick, sharp-eyed and restless, paused in the middle of his lecture when he noticed too many Mortys leaning forward at once, their gazes not at him, but toward one another. It was a flicker, a ripple across the sea of sameness, and though it lasted no longer than a breath, he caught it. His eyes narrowed, his tone shifted. From then on, the Ricks began watching more carefully. They called Mortys at random, separating them into smaller groups, scattering them in assignments that made little sense. It was subtle, almost casual, yet beneath it was suspicion, the quiet weight of fear disguised as authority. Evil Morty felt it immediately. The balance was tilting. One evening the restless boy came to him, his steps quick, his voice hushed. "They're pulling us apart," he whispered. "They think if we're alone, we'll forget." Evil Morty looked at him for a long moment, then answered softly, "Do you forget?" The boy shook his head fiercely. "Never." Other Mortys began finding ways to resist, not loudly, not recklessly, but in the smallest acts. Passing notes disguised as equations, lingering in corridors for a few extra seconds, meeting eyes across crowded rooms, with meaning heavy enough to silence a lifetime of orders. And always the whispered phrase returned, carried from one breath to another like a secret thread. The caretaker appeared briefly as though drawn by the growing tension. His expression was weary, yet touched with a faint pride. "They are trying to scatter you," he said. "But scattering stars does not erase the sky. It only makes constellations harder to see." Evil Morty listened quietly, letting the words rest in him. He did not ask for advice. He no longer needed to. That night, he sketched again. This time, not a flame or a constellation, but a single bridge stretched across an empty page. On one side, he drew a figure standing alone. On the other, he left space blank, open, waiting. When the restless boy saw it, he whispered, "You've already started building it, haven't you?" Evil Morty said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Sleep came late, but when it did, the dream was clear. He walked across that bridge in silence, and as he reached the middle, countless footsteps began to follow behind him. He never turned to look. He didn't need to. The trial was disguised as a lesson, but every Morty in the room felt the shift the moment it began. A Rick with cold, deliberate eyes called Evil Morty forward, placing before him a puzzle that stretched across the desk like a trap. Numbers wound into symbols, lines into impossible shapes. "Solve it," the Rick said, his voice too calm. "Show us all what makes you different." The air thickened. Mortys watched in silence, breaths shallow, hearts pressed tight against their ribs. They knew this was no lesson. It was a test, a performance staged for the sake of breaking one of their own. Evil Morty felt the gaze pressing on him, heavier than the puzzle itself. He looked at the paper, then at the Rick, then at the countless eyes waiting. The hum inside him stirred, steady, unshaken. He moved the pencil slowly, not rushing, hesitating, tracing careful lines across the page. He did not solve the puzzle in the way it was meant to be solved. Instead, he drew a circle through its heart, a loop that tied the scattered fragments together. When he set the pencil down, the room was utterly still. The Rick frowned, lips twitching as though unsure whether to laugh or scold. "That isn't the answer," he said finally. Evil Morty met his gaze, calm and certain. "It's an answer." For a long, weighted silence, nothing moved. Then the Rick smirked and waved him away, pretending indifference. But the Mortys had seen. They had felt it. The test had not broken him. It had revealed him. Later that night, the restless boy whispered, with awe, "You drew your own answer. You didn't play their game." Evil Morty only shook his head. "No, I showed that their game has more than one ending." The boy's smile trembled, fragile and bright. "That's enough to change everything." In his solitude, Evil Morty sketched again, this time a spiral opening outward into light. He stared at it for a long time, then closed his eyes. Sleep carried him gently, and in his dream the spiral grew until it filled the sky, endless and unbroken, a path no Rick could chart. The movement had no name, no leader, no declaration. It rose like mist, unannounced, impossible to hold in one's hands. Mortys, who had once kept their heads low, now lingered near each other a little longer. They shared food, shared fragments of thought, shared the soft comfort of a phrase that carried more weight than any order ever could. Even shadows cast light when they gather together. The words drifted in the halls, not spoken loudly, but felt like a pulse beneath the Citadel's endless hum. Evil Morty noticed it not in grand gestures, but in the smallest signs. A boy who once ate alone now sat at a crowded table. Another, who had been silent for weeks, finally spoke, his voice trembling yet steady. They were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of remembering that they were not machines, not echoes, not disposable. The Ricks tried to scatter them, tried to increase the pace of their assignments, tried to divide them with endless comparisons. But the Mortys no longer moved only as shadows. They moved as threads, crossing and recrossing in ways too subtle to unravel. The more the Ricks pressed, the more those threads tightened. One night, the restless boy leaned against Evil Morty's desk, watching as another constellation took shape on the page. His voice was hushed, but certain. "They'd look to you even when you don't speak. You've become the point where their threads meet." Evil Morty set the pencil down, staring at the stars he had drawn. "And if the threads break?" The boy shook his head, his eyes filled with quiet faith. "Then they will find each other again, because once seen, the pattern can't be forgotten." The caretaker did not return. Perhaps his silence was its own message. a sign that the boy's words were truth enough. Evil Morty did not feel abandoned. He felt that the watching had passed from one guardian to many. That night, in his dream, he walked beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. None were written in books or charts, yet all were real. And when he looked closer, he saw that each star was a Morty, shining faintly, but together forming shapes that no Rick could name, no Rick could claim. The Citadel had always thrummed with noise, a machinery of voices and footsteps, orders and replies, the endless loop of Ricks commanding and Mortys obeying. Yet it was not the noise that betrayed the change, it was the silences. In corridors, once filled with hurried shuffling, there were pauses as Mortys lingered a heartbeat too long. In classrooms, questions that had once gone unanswered were now met with murmured replies, soft as the flutter of moth wings. The Ricks began to notice, not because the Mortys shouted, but because they did not. Evil Morty saw the first sign of danger when a Rick narrowed his eyes during meal rotation, scanning the tables where Mortys sat closer than before. The Rick said nothing, but the weight of his gaze pressed down like a knife laid carefully on the table. Others soon followed, their suspicion sharpening. Meetings were called, schedules redrawn, patrols doubled. The Ricks could not name what they feared, only that something was slipping beyond their grasp. The restless boy returned to Evil Morty with his usual spark dimmed. "They see us now. They don't know what we are, but they feel it." Evil Morty closed his notebook, the constellations within hidden between paper and silence. "Then the time of shadows is ending," he said. The boy asked, "And if they force us into the open?" Evil Morty looked at him, his face calm though his heart was not. "Then we must be more than what they expect." Not noise, not rebellion. Something quieter, but stronger. That night he walked the halls alone, sensing eyes on him though none dared confront him. The Citadel itself felt different, as if its walls strained to hear the whispers inside them. He realized that concealment was not safety anymore. It was a bridge, and they had already crossed it. The Ricks were beginning to gather their weapons of control, but the Mortys had gathered something else. Memory, trust, the fragile but unbreakable recognition of one another. When Evil Morty finally returned to his room, he drew a constellation, unlike the others. This one had no name, no familiar shape. It was a pattern born not of stars, but of the spaces between them. He stared at it until sleep claimed him, knowing it was only a matter of time before the Ricks demanded answers. And when they did, he would have to choose what light to give them. The summons came without warning. A pair of guards appeared at the door, their faces unreadable, their tone clipped. Evil Morty was told to follow, no explanation given. He walked without hesitation, the restless boy watching from the corner of the corridor, his hands tightening into fists but saying nothing. To resist would have been to break the fragile pattern too soon. To walk was to buy time. The path wound through unfamiliar corridors deeper into the Citadel's heart. The walls here were bare, stripped of the usual screens and data streams. Silence pressed close, broken only by the echo of boots. At last, they entered a chamber filled with light, too white, too clean. A table waited at its center, surrounded by Ricks. Their coats shimmered under the glare, but their eyes carried shadows. One Rick spoke first, his voice smooth but sharp. "We've noticed gatherings, Mortys sitting where they don't belong. Mortys whispering when they should be silent. And you," his finger cut the air toward Evil Morty, "are always nearby." Another Rick leaned forward, his tone almost gentle. We don't mind Morty's dreaming, as long as the dreams serve us. But dreams that grow into patterns, those become dangerous, Evil. Morty said nothing. His silence unsettled them more than words might have. One Rick slammed his hand against the table, demanding an answer. What are you planning? Evil Morty lifted his gaze slowly, his voice calm as still water. I am not planning. We are remembering. The words lingered, strange in their simplicity. The Ricks exchanged glances, some with irritation, others with unease. They dismissed him at last, but it was no release. It was a test, a probe to see if his stillness would crack. The guards led him back through the corridors, their grips tighter than before. When he returned to his quarters, the restless boy was waiting. What did they do? He asked. Evil Morty shook his head. They asked what cannot be unasked. The time of silence is ending. That night, the Citadel's hum felt different, tense, expectant, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Evil Morty drew once more, but his lines no longer mapped stars. They mapped choices, each one leading toward a horizon that could not be avoided. The first fracture came quietly, like the faint crack in glass no one notices until it spreads. Among the gathered Mortys, whispers of fear began to bloom. One boy spoke in hushed tones, saying he had seen the guards linger too long outside their quarters. Another claimed a Rick had questioned him alone, asking whether he trusted the others. Fear does not shout at first. It tiptoes, it settles in corners, it grows like frost across windows. Evil Morty listened as they spoke. He did not argue, nor did he try to drown out their worries. Instead, he reminded them softly of why they had gathered. Do you remember the dream? He asked. The dream of walking through the Citadel without chains. The dream where our voices mattered as much as theirs. His words carried no fire, only warmth. And in that warmth, some of the frost melted, but not all. One boy, younger than most, shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the door. What if they're right? He whispered. What if Ricks are meant to lead, and Mortys are meant to follow? Maybe this is just the way of things. His voice trembled, but the words carried a weight heavier than defiance, resignation. The others fell silent, unsettled by hearing their deepest fear spoken aloud. Evil Morty stepped closer to him, lowering his voice until it was more like a lullaby than a reply. Do you feel it in your chest? He asked. The ache when they dismiss you? Do you feel the smallness they press upon you, the way they say you are nothing but a shield for their mistakes? That ache is not weakness, it is proof you were meant for more. The boy blinked, tears gathering at the edge of his eyes. He did not answer, but he did not look away. The restless boy leaned forward, adding his own voice. I used to think I was meant to follow too, but every time I did, I felt hollow. Standing here with all of you, it feels different. It feels like I belong. The words were clumsy, but they were true. And truth, even in fragile form, has power. The younger Morty's shoulders loosened, his doubt softening like snow in sunlight. Still the fracture did not vanish. It lingered beneath the surface, reminding Evil Morty that belief is not steady stone but shifting sand. He knew the Ricks would push harder, searching for weakness, feeding on fear. The unity of Morty's was tender, easily wounded, but in their tenderness he also saw something the Ricks could never understand, a capacity for trust, for care, for loyalty that did not demand hierarchy. That night, the Mortys stayed together longer than usual, their voices weaving through the dim-lit halls like a chorus of fragile courage. They did not solve their doubts, nor did they erase their fear, but they sat close, shoulder to shoulder, and in that closeness found a kind of quiet strength. Evil Morty did not smile, but his silence carried something new, an assurance that cracks could be mended, if only by choosing to remain side by side. The Ricks tightened their hold with subtle cruelty, not sudden violence. They summoned Mortys at odd hours, questioning them with smiles that never reached their eyes. They shifted schedules, making it harder for the Mortys to meet unnoticed. Even the food rations seemed to change, smaller portions, colder trays, as though reminding them of their dependence. Every adjustment whispered the same lesson: you are watched, you are small, you are ours. Some Mortys grew restless, their nerves stretched thin. One confessed to Evil Morty in a trembling voice that he could no longer sleep. Another admitted he felt eyes on him, even when he was alone. Fear, once quiet, became constant background noise, like the hum of a machine you cannot turn off. Evil Morty listened to each of them without judgment. He did not offer promises he could not keep. He simply stayed present, a steady anchor in their storm of doubt. The restless boy noticed the change too. "They're trying to break us apart," he said one evening. "If we stop meeting, they win. But if we keep meeting, they'll notice more." His eyes searched Evil Morty's face, seeking an answer. But Evil Morty did not give one right away. Instead, he asked a question. Which fear feels heavier to you, losing what we are building or facing what they might do? The boy fell silent, realizing the choice had already been made in his heart. And so they adapted. Instead of gathering in one place, the Mortys began leaving small signs for one another, drawings tucked into books, fragments of whispered phrases passed in hallways. It was less direct, more fragile, but it kept the thread alive. Evil Morty encouraged them to see these gestures not as weakness, but as proof of their resilience. "A whisper can outlast a shout," he reminded them softly, "because whispers linger where shouts burn out." The Ricks noticed the quiet, but not the meaning. They mistook silence for surrender, as they always did. Their arrogance blinded them to the way Mortys wove bonds out of scraps and fragments. And in that blindness, space remained for hope. Late one night, Evil Morty sat alone in his quarters, tracing invisible lines across the air with his finger. The maps he once drew on paper now lived in his memory, shifting and alive. He no longer charted stars or corridors, but something deeper. The fragile, luminous paths of loyalty, trust, and courage. They were not straight lines. They curved and tangled, but they led forward all the same. And in that quiet mapping, he saw the faint outline of a future the Ricks could not erase. One born not of dominance, but of persistence. A future where Mortys learned that even under chains they could carry something untouchable inside them. The vision began not with a speech, but with a moment of stillness. The Mortys gathered in a narrow storage room, the hum of the Citadel muffled by thick walls. Some were weary, others anxious, but all carried the faint ember of hope that had survived every test. Evil Morty did not stand above them or raise his voice. Instead, he sat among them, his hands folded loosely, his eyes steady. He spoke in a tone softer than the shadows around them. We have lived our lives as pieces on a board someone else built. We have been told our place, our purpose, our limits. But what if the board itself is not real? What if we are more than the shape they gave us? His words did not thunder. They flowed like water, patient and persistent, filling the silence with quiet possibility. The restless boy leaned forward, eyes shining with something close to hunger. You mean we could be more than just their shields, more than their mistakes? Evil Morty turned to him, his gaze kind. You already are. Every time you dream, every time you question, you step beyond the role they carved for you. You are not just a shield. You are a story still being written. The Mortys listened, their hearts caught between doubt and wonder. One asked what freedom might look like. Evil Morty smiled faintly. I cannot describe it for you. Freedom is not a picture I can draw. It is a feeling you will know when you no longer bow your head, when you no longer shrink at the sound of their voices. It is the day you realize you are no longer afraid to be yourself. A hush followed his words. No one moved. The idea was too vast, too fragile, yet it planted itself quietly like a seed pressing into soil. They did not speak of overthrowing, of battles, of rebellion. Those belonged to the language of Ricks. What they nurtured instead was subtler, a shift in how they saw themselves, a refusal to let their worth be defined by another. The younger Morty, who once doubted most deeply, lifted his eyes. But how do we keep this alive when they keep trying to smother it? Evil Morty reached out, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. By remembering. By carrying it in small acts, in kindness, in patience, in loyalty to each other. They cannot smother what lives in silence and grows in hearts. That night when they parted, the Mortys carried not just fear, but also a quiet clarity. The Ricks might control their bodies, their schedules, their routines, but something had slipped beyond their grasp. A vision, small and trembling, had taken root. And once a vision is planted, it cannot be unseen. Time in the Citadel drifted differently after the vision took hold. Days felt longer, not because the Ricks had changed, but because the Mortys had. Every look, every whisper, every shared silence carried weight. What once felt like routine now felt like waiting. Waiting for something unnamed, something fragile but certain. Evil Morty noticed it most in their eyes. Where fear once filled the space entirely, now there was a thin line of light running through. The Ricks remained blind to it. They congratulated themselves on control, mistaking obedience for surrender. They saw Mortys, still sitting where they were told, still filing down the same corridors. They did not see the way a glance could pass between them, carrying a message, too quiet for words. They did not hear the hum of trust that had begun to flow, steady as a hidden river beneath stone. Evil Morty often walked alone, but he was never truly alone anymore. He could feel the presence of those who believed, not in him alone, but in themselves. And though he never called it leadership, he understood he had become a symbol. Not because he claimed power, but because he had dared to remind them of their own. Symbols, he realized, are not chosen. They emerge quietly from the spaces between hearts. The restless boy remained closest to him, always asking questions, always pushing against silence. One evening, he sat beside Evil Morty in a dim corner, voice low. Do you ever get tired of carrying it? This hope? This vision? Evil Morty thought for a long while before answering. It is heavy, yes, but it is lighter when shared. And when I see it in your eyes, it no longer feels like mine alone. It feels like ours. The boy smiled faintly, leaning back against the wall, as if the answer itself was a kind of rest. The nights grew slower, dreamlike. The Citadel still hummed, still gleamed with its endless machinery, but within the Mortys something had shifted beyond repair. They began to dream not of escape alone, but of memory, how they wanted to be remembered, how they might leave behind more than silence. Legacy, they realized, did not need grand monuments. It could live in the smallest of gestures, a shared glance, a hidden word, the courage to remain unbroken. And as Evil Morty lay awake one night, staring into the dim ceiling above, he felt it settle in him too. The future was uncertain, perhaps even unreachable, but the change was already real, already alive. Whatever came next, they had claimed something no Rick could ever take, the quiet knowledge that they mattered. The Citadel never changed in the way the Ricks imagined it would. Its lights still glowed, its machines still hummed, its corridors still stretched in endless repetition, but something invisible had shifted forever. Within the Mortys, silence no longer meant surrender. It meant connection. It meant remembering. Evil Morty walked the same halls he had always walked, yet they felt different beneath his steps. Every face he passed carried a trace of the vision, even if hidden, even if fragile. Some Mortys lowered their eyes, but when they lifted them again, there was a quiet spark. He knew then that legacy was not measured in victories, but in seeds, small, invisible things planted in countless hearts. The restless boy stayed near until the end, though even he began to understand that endings are not sudden. One evening, he whispered, "Will they ever truly let us be free?" Evil Morty paused before answering, his gaze steady. Perhaps not. But freedom does not wait for permission. It grows the moment you believe you deserve it. And that belief cannot be taken. The boy nodded, his breathing slow, as though the answer was a lullaby meant to rest inside him forever. Days blurred into nights, and nights into something softer. Still, the vision did not end. It simply became part of them, like a song hummed quietly under breath, never loud enough to draw attention, but never lost. Evil Morty felt no triumph, no need for declaration. He simply felt the stillness of knowing he had lit a candle in a place of endless dark, and that candle would keep burning long after his steps were gone. In time, he closed his eyes and allowed the Citadel's hum to fade into something gentler, something closer to the sound of dreams. The halls stretched on, but so did the stories, carried in the whispers of Mortys who remembered, who chose to believe, who chose to keep walking together. And somewhere, even now, he is still out there, dreaming beneath the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.